In the frozen dawn of February 1933, the Ukrainian Soviet Republic ceased to be a nation and became a laboratory of deprivation. While the world watched and praised the rise of industrial monuments in Moscow, the psychiatric wards of the borderlands were being systematically deleted from the physical world, under the direct supervision of Genrik Yagoda, a man who would later be executed by the very machine he helped build. Meanwhile, the GPU secret police enacted the sanitary cordons. These were not designed to keep diseases out. They were designed to keep the evidence of the state-sponsored collapse hidden. The psychiatric hospitals, already crumbling under the weight of the Great Break, were classified as category for non-productive units. This was a death sentence in bureaucratic ink. The instruction sent to the barrier detachments was cold and surgically precise. No grain, no seed, and no medical supplies were to cross the perimeter. The asylums were effectively turned into closed ecosystems. Imagine a stone-walled facility, designed for 500 people, now packed with 2,000. As the state began sweeping socially dangerous elements off the streets to hide the starving population from foreign eyes, the doctors within these walls were trapped in a dark irony. They were men and women of science, trained in the Pavlovian theories of the mind, now forced to watch the total regression of the human psyche. The silence that fell over these institutions was not the silence of peace. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a void. The secret police did not need to fire a single bullet. They simply stood at the gates with rifles, watching the clock. Every hour that passed was a tactical success for the regime. Behind the rusted iron bars, the social contract did not just break, it evaporated the staff themselves. Surviving on thin soups of boiled leather and tree bark, began to view the patients not as humans in need of care, but as competing organisms in a fight for a finite amount of oxygen. The administrative erasure was so complete that for months, the outside world believed these hospitals were still functioning, while inside, the stone corridors were becoming the staging ground for a biological event that the Soviet files would hide for half a century. Starvation is not a singular event. It is a progressive, multi-stage failure of the human machine. By March 1933, the closed wards had entered the stage of total biological rebellion. To the surgical observer, the physical changes were terrifying. This was the era of opucania, the starvation edema, as the body consumes its own muscle tissue to keep the heart beating. The protein levels in the blood drop to near zero. Osmotic pressure fails. Fluid leaks from the vessels into the surrounding tissue. In the asylums, the corridors were filled with living balloons. These were men and women whose legs and torsos had swollen to 3 times their normal size. Their skin grew translucent, shiny, and so tight that the slightest touch could cause it to tear like wet paper. But the physical swelling was merely the shell of the horror. The real data lies in the neurological collapse known as starvation insanity. The human brain is a high-energy organ. When deprived of glucose, the prefrontal cortex, the seat of morality and logic, shuts down. The primitive lizard brain takes control. In the declassified medical journals of 1933, doctors describe a phenomenon they called the shining eye. Patients who had been catatonic for years suddenly became hyper-alert, their pupils dilated, and their movements jerky and predatory. They were not seeing the hospital walls anymore. They were seeing a world made of meat. This was the methodical regression. The patients began to lose the ability to speak, reverting to guttural grunts and animalistic hisses. The healing wards became arenas of pure instinct. Doctors recorded instances of patients gnawing on the wooden bed frames and eating the plaster off the walls until their gums bled out. The psychological trauma was so deep that it bypassed the conscious mind. It was a mass neurological reset. The Soviet regime looked at this and saw a successful clearing of defective genes. They were not just killing people. They were proving that under enough pressure, the new Soviet man was nothing more than a desperate animal. This data was harvested by the state, analyzed in clinical white rooms, and then buried in the special files to ensure the world never knew how efficiently a government could dismantle the human soul. In the basement of the Ukrainian Ministry of Internal Affairs sits a collection of papers known as Opus 16. This is the special file. It is a repository of reports so dark they were kept hidden even from high-ranking party members. Within these pages lies document 1022. This is the clinical breakdown of cannibalism within the asylums. The GPU secret police were not investigators in the traditional sense. They were accountants of depravity. They meticulously recorded cases where the closed ecosystem finally turned inward. These reports are written in a cold, detached, heartless way that mirrors the emotionless attitude of the GPU. The file describes wards where the hierarchy of the sane and insane was entirely inverted. The most aggressive patients became the providers. They formed hunting units in the dark of the night, utilizing the absolute lack of lighting to their advantage. The GPU did not step in to stop the slaughter. Their internal memos reveal a different strategy of observation and containment. They wanted to see the natural conclusion of the experiment. When a cannibalism event was reported, the secret police would wait for the act to be completed before entering to arrest the degenerate element. These prisoners were then processed through a unique legal loophole. Because the Soviet Penal Code did not technically have a law against cannibalism, the state officially claimed such a thing was impossible in a socialist utopia. They were charged under Article 174, which was grand larceny of state property. The property in question was the bodies of the other inmates. The special file contains photographs that would be flagged by any algorithm today. These are monochromatic, grainy images of empty wards, where the only thing left were the leather restraints and the scratch marks on the floor. This was not a riot. It was a harvest. The state-mandated void had created a vacuum so powerful that it sucked the humanity out of everyone involved. From the starving inmate to the secret police officer who stood by with a stopwatch and a clipboard. If the asylums were the laboratory, Nazino Island was the field test. In May 1933, the regime expanded the closed ward protocol to the Siberian wilderness. 6,700 declassed people, including many who had been snatched from psychiatric wards, were loaded onto barges and dumped on a swampy island in the Ob River, were given no tools, no shelter, and no food except for sacks of raw flour dumped directly into the mud. The Nazino Protocol was a deliberate acceleration of the asylum collapse. Within 24 hours, the first murders began. Within 72 hours, the island had earned its historical name, Cannibal Island. The GPU guards stationed on the riverbanks watched through binoculars. Their reports, sent directly to Vyacheslav Molotov, are chillingly clinical. They describe prisoners making leathery cakes out of flour and river water, only to have them stolen by roving gangs. When the flour was gone, the settlers turned to the only available protein. One declassified report describes a young woman who was tied to a tree by a gang of men. They cut off her calves and breasts while she was still conscious, cooking the meat over a small fire as she bled out. The guards did not intervene because they were part of the experiment. They were tasked with seeing if socially harmful people could be forged through extreme hardship. The result was a 100% failure rate. By the time the barges returned to pick up the survivors, only 2,000 of the original 6,700 remained. Most were walking skeletons, their minds completely shattered by the island psychosis. This was the ultimate proof of a state turning the undesirables world into a high-security ward where the only rule was survival. The Nazino Protocol remains one of the most craziest horror stories in human history, and is a testament to what happens when surgical governance meets an absolute lack of empathy. The final stage of the special harvest was the linguistic erasure of the dead. In the Soviet Union of 1933, starvation did not exist as a cause of death. To list it on a medical certificate was an act of treason. Doctors in the asylums were forced into a surgical silence. When thousands of patients died within weeks, the causes were listed as digestive failure, cardiovascular collapse, or the catch-all weakness of the Constitution. This was the paperwork purge. The regime understood that if you control the language, you control the history. In the archives of the Kyiv Psychiatric Hospital, researchers found thousands of death certificates from 1933 where the cause of death column was simply left blank, or marked with a single dash. This dash represented the state-mandated void. The bodies were disposed of in sanitary trenches, which were mass graves dug at night on the hospital grounds. The staff themselves, so weakened by hunger that they could barely lift a shovel, were often found dead in the same trenches the next morning. It was a self-consuming cycle of administrative efficiency. The falsified death was not just about hiding the numbers, it was about destroying the identity of the victims. By refusing to acknowledge the famine, the state denied the victims their status as human beings. They were simply biological waste being moved from one ledger to another. This is the ultimate surgical horror. It is the realization that a government can kill millions of people, and then simply delete the event from the collective memory using nothing but a pen and a rubber stamp. For 50 years, the closed wards of Ukraine remained a ghost story, until the special files were finally cracked open, revealing that the insanity was not in the patients, but in the bureaucrats who designed their erasure.